Hey, what's happening, everybody? Today is June 15th, and this is day 11 of 37 Conversations. I apologize. Last night I said it was, I think, June 10th, and it was the 10th day of 37 Conversations. It was day 10, but I said it was June 10th in that recording when I went live for that. I was tired yesterday, long day, protesting and all that stuff, so that's my excuse for that. So today, the conversation that I was going to introduce with you all is the equity versus equality conversation. In this moment right now that we're in, you're seeing a lot of statements that people are making, celebrities. I saw one today that Baker Mayfield, the quarterback for the Cleveland Browns, made, where he was talking about equality is necessary, equality is where we need to be, and so on. And he's not wrong. He's not wrong in that. But I think the quality is the first step, right? Just similar to last night when we talked about diversity versus inclusion. With diversity being the initial step, and then inclusion getting us closer to the finish line. I personally believe that equality is the first step, but equity gets us closer to the finish line. As a result of generations and generations and years of systemic racism and institutional racism in different aspects of our society, people of color in this country, equality isn't enough. People of color in this country have had disparities in health as it relates to their socioeconomic as well as communities that they live in. People of color have had difficulty with access to education, where you talk about the access to healthcare, access to housing. So there are a lot of great depictions of, you could Google it, there are a lot of great depictions of equity versus equality that you can find online. There's one really good depiction of people looking over a fence. It's like a cartoon. If you haven't seen that, I would Google that. Equity versus equality, looking over a fence or something like that, and that will probably come up. But the example and the analogy that I use, similar to last night when I was talking about diversity versus inclusion, with diversity being having a party or a dance and you inviting everyone to the party, that's diversity, whereas inclusion is asking someone to dance. Well, equity versus equality, the analogy that I utilize is, say you have a ninth grade basketball team, right? And you give everyone, size 10 shoes to play the game, right? Well, that's equality. Equity would be giving them the shoes that fit their feet in order for them to play the game. And, as we just mentioned a second ago, due to, systemic racism, systemic oppression, institutionalized racism, communities of color are in a disadvantage in many respects, oftentimes, as it relates to being equitable, having equitable opportunities in comparison to our white counterparts. So, that's a lens that I encourage people to apply to the equity versus equality approach. I think that it's very important to understand and identify that, society and societal issues are, since they're so systemic, that's the reason why you have the need for equity. That's the reason why you have an equity discussion. And that's why you're having this equity discussion. I mean, socially, on the street as a person of color, sure, I want equality. When I'm in a grocery store, or if I'm in a department store, I want to be treated just like my other, white counterparts. I don't want someone to think I'm stealing something. I don't want someone to, follow me around from place to place. You hear in education how, you have students of color who get in trouble more than their white counterparts, or, they're sent to the principal's office more than their white counterparts. To me, that's a equality issue. Sure, I want to, in that respect, you certainly want to be treated like your white, majority counterparts. But the equity piece comes where, additional resources, sometimes additional funding, sometimes additional support needs to be provided to communities as a result of the systemic oppression and the systemic marginalization that those communities experience. This is all part of that, in my opinion, Black Lives Matter debate and conversation. I shouldn't really say debate, but part of that Black Lives Matter conversation, because again, I'll be harping on this probably for the rest of the 37 conversations. I already have a little bit before, but this conversation and this movement should be more about than police brutality. Well, certainly police brutality is, certainly an issue we need to address without a doubt. I mean, people are losing their lives, but there are also other aspects of society that impact Black people's lives, again, as it relates to healthcare, as it relates to education, environmental justice. And it's critical for us to identify how people are being marginalized further within those particular social issues and societal issues. So, there's there are a lot of nonprofit organizations who have their eyes on this. There are a lot of foundations that invest in communities of color for this specific reason, to shore up those and bolster those communities, to make them more equitable. I encourage people from a health standpoint. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, they do a lot of investments in communities of color as it relates to access to healthcare. I know some of this stuff because I work in philanthropy, as I mentioned in the conversation the other night. My role is, doing community giving here in Florida as well as Louisiana in the position that I'm in right now. So, another foundation that's here locally in Tampa is the Helios Education Foundation, and they're based in Arizona, but they do community giving here in Tampa, and they also do giving in Arizona as well. I bring these examples up because there are a lot of intentional efforts that are being made by foundations, by nonprofit organizations to conduct research, to identify where those inequalities exist within our communities, and because they have an understanding that, there are populations within our society that have been marginalized and that have been systemically marginalized over time. There are times where I've had, as a part of these conversations, there are friends that, have talked about affirmative action, for instance. And, I think affirmative action narrowly, survived a Supreme Court, either a decision or what's the word I'm looking for? Challenge, a Supreme Court challenge. And a part of affirmative action, my freshman year at the University of Florida was in 2001. That was the last year, I think what was called First Year Florida, where there were, where race was a part of the, I guess you can say, equation, if you will, that helped get, regarding acceptance into college, right? Well, having racial quotas, if you will, or, having race being a decision maker as it relates to college admission was found to be unconstitutional. But I bring up affirmative action. I bring up, examples like First Year Florida to make the point that, we have sometimes our white counterparts who speak about, well, it's like, they get a leg up on me, or, they have a leg up on us, or whatever the case may be, regarding people of color, regarding women, of course, because affirmative action was also written with women in mind as well. But what I think people don't realize is that efforts such as affirmative action were instituted to ultimately right the wrongs, the historical wrongs that were systemic as it related to hiring practices, as it related to, college admission. Of course, that's why HBCUs exist, because there was a point in time in which, Black people and people of color couldn't attend, other, state colleges and other colleges and such because of the color of their skin. So it's important for us to understand that historical context and why those our measures have been in place, just like the Civil Rights Act, that happened in the 60s. That was to, because that was to right the wrongs that have happened, previous to that moment in time, but then also to ensure that there was a level of equity that was being provided to those populations as well. And yeah, someone said in the comments that was not that long ago. I just think that, when we're having the equity versus equality conversation, they're both good, right? Everyone wants to be treated equally and treated fairly, right? And that's the equality piece. But we have to also understand that some of those communities need additional support. They need additional resources and investment to ensure that, those schools are just as equal as schools in, another part of the community, that healthcare that's being provided to the citizens in that particular community, say a community of color, is equal to healthcare that's being provided to citizens in the community, where, maybe the population is more white. So, it's just, I think it's a very easy and understandable and simple to digest kind of a concept, as we're talking about equity versus equality. Certainly in these conversations, people have brought that up, when I'm referencing equity, when I'm referencing equality, and, not really understanding, I think, or grasping the difference between the two. And also, again, there's a lot of great research out there. There's a lot of, foundations and nonprofits that are investing in this space, corporate grant makers, such as the corporation that I work with, and in my capacity, working in corporate social responsibility. We have an eye on that because it's important. That doesn't mean to say that you don't invest in, communities that are comprised mostly of white, citizens. That does not mean that at all. I think it more so means that you're doing more of what you should be doing or could be doing or need to be doing, because there are people, as we talked about with intersectionality the other night, there are people who are being marginalized further within a, social issue such as healthcare, education, housing, so on and so forth, because of the color of their skin, because of, the part of the community that they live in, which, oftentimes happens to be predominantly, communities of color. So, that's it for tonight. Today was a long day. That's why I went live so late today. Work was busy and had a lot going on. I got some more products I need to work on even after this live. But yeah, think about that. Think about equity versus equality, and understand that, my message isn't about, I'm not saying that simply, one's worse than the other, or even, better than the other per se. But I think we need to understand that equality is the start. Sure, you need to treat everyone, the right way. The golden rule: treat others like you want to be treated. That's the equality piece. But equity is a matter of ensuring that people have the resources that they need to be able to play the game, as I mentioned in that example about, that basketball team and such, because by virtue of the fact that some people live in communities of color, come from communities of color, or are a person of color, there are inequities that unfortunately have been present in society as a result of those issues. So not issues, but as a result of those, being a part of that demographic or part of the community. So that's it for tonight. Again, please, have these conversations with those around you and such. I'd be curious to know. Again, drop it in the comments. Shoot me a message. I appreciate it in the comments more, honestly, because it creates a dialogue. It enables people to share what they're learning and identify maybe a new angle on a matter or angle on a subject that we've been discussing during this conversation series and such. So tomorrow we're gonna have a conversation about white privilege. I'm bringing one of my good friends in on the conversation. Her name is Jennifer Yegley. Real good friend of mine here in the community here in Tampa. She's awesome. She's done a lot of, social justice work, social equity work in her past, and she does that even, to this day as well. So that's going to be tomorrow at 8:00. We already have that set up. So I'll be putting the promo out for that. So please share that. I think that's a message that, a lot of people would find valuable. That regarding, the white privilege conversation, most certainly our white counterparts, but then also people of color as well, because I think that some people of color certainly believe that white privilege exists. They certainly understand that white privilege exists, but they may not understand some of the key aspects of it. So I'm looking forward to that conversation with Jen tomorrow. It's going to be great, and I hope you can join me, and I hope you have a good night. Talk to you later.